So today I want to talk about the $1,000,000 question. This is something that I get asked all the time as an occupational therapist. People trying to figure out, is my child's behavior, is it sensory or is it behavioral, and how to address it. So I hate to say it right off the bat, there is no clear-cut answer as to if something is truly sensory or truly behavioral. I can't tell you if your child is doing A, B, and C, then it means that it's sensory. If he's doing these things, then it's behavioral. It's not, only because the nature of both sensory and behavioral are completely linked, right? So we take in information from our environment through our senses, and we have a behavioral output. So those two things are linked all the time. So it's very difficult for us to be able to say, to be clear and say this is this and this is that. But not to say that we don't get clues from what is happening, and gives us a better idea on what to look for and how to delineate between the two of them, and then from there what approach we take to be able to help our child redirect. So as therapists, what we do as occupational therapists, what we do is usually give parents a sensory questionnaire to complete. And it just gives us an idea about what sensory challenges a child may have. It kind of like helps us create a profile on the sensory challenges that a child can have, so then we can get a better idea on actually what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses, and maybe some of the triggers that we have to look out for. So if we do take the time to really play detectives, we can really get a lot clearer about the nature of a child's behavior. Again, is it sensory or is it something that's behavioral? So what I challenge you to do is really become detectives, right? This is not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen through time, where you start tracking your child's behavior. So by that I mean 3 things that you need to do. Number 1, you want to look at what is the antecedent. I think that's how you say it. I speak French, so I'm thinking of it in French. But what happens right before your child is having either a meltdown or a tantrum? So right before that, you want to look at what's going on. What triggered it? Can you find a behavioral trigger, something that happened, they didn't get their way, or is it something more sensory, right? Either the lights, the sounds, something's happening. So you want to kind of track what happens right before the behavior that you see. Then you also want to start writing down how the child is reacting while they're having this meltdown or this tantrum or this whatever behavior they're having. You want to write down some of the key points of what's going on. How are they trying to calm themselves, or how are they trying to get their way? Are they banging their head on the wall? Are they yelling? Are they screaming? Are they crying? Not crying? These are all things that you want to look at. And then the third thing you want to look at is, how did they calm? That's going to be a huge, huge piece, actually. What strategies you used that were successful to help them calm, right? So those are the 3 things that you want to look at when you want to become a detective about, all right, where are we going with this? Is this sensory? Is this behavioral, right? Start tracking it. And since we're creatures of habit, there's going to be a pattern that comes up eventually, right? And you'll be able to figure out what those triggers are, and if something is sensory or if something is behavioral, or surprise, surprise, if something is both, actually. And a lot of times that's what we actually do see, that it's a trigger. The triggers are both. It's both sensory and behavioral. So that's where it gets a little bit trickier, but there are approaches to be able to help with those behaviors. So when something is truly behavioral in nature, it's usually purpose-driven, right? A child is trying to get their way with something. I don't like using the word manipulative, but at the end of the day, that's what it is, right? They're acting a certain way because they want to get something. They want to get their way with something, or get away from something as well, right? So the first thing is that it's purpose-driven when it's behavioral. The second thing is, and this I think is really key that you can look at, a child can turn it on and off very easily, right? They get their way, it turns off, right? That's it, now they're fine. If not, you know, sometimes they'll do a little check. They're checking to see if they have an audience, right? So that turning on and off is usually because it's behavioral in nature. And again, once a child gets their way, the third thing is once a child gets their way, you know, the behavior stops, right? So that's another thing that tells me that it's only behavioral and we're not talking sensory here. And in order to affect these behaviors, actually what we see is that a child responds very well to clear boundaries and to structure when it's something that's behavioral, right? What's expected, what's unexpected, what are consequences? You know, if it's something that's truly behavioral in nature, they'll do very well with those behavioral modifications and with clear-cut structure and boundaries, right? Now, when we're talking something that's more sensory in nature, this is a whole different animal, right? We're looking at something else. Although it is, you know, they react to it with behavior, but the nature of it is something that's sensory. So when it's sensory in nature, it's outside of a child's control. And I think that's the key that we have to really keep in mind. This is outside their control. They cannot control what's going on with themselves, and they're trying to really hard. The way that they're reacting is actually them trying to regain control. They cannot, so again, they won't be able to turn it on and off. And what we see is actually the contrary when they even do get what they want, when we're mixing, let's say, both behavioral and sensory. When they do end up getting what they want, they actually still can't calm, right? They're still crying. They're still having a hard time coming down from it. And that tells me, again, that this is because it's something that's sensory in nature. Another thing is, the third thing is that it takes longer for them to calm when it's something that's sensory. And key for this is that it does not respond to behavioral modifications alone, right? You can't just do, let's say, a reward chart or set up boundaries for them and be clear-cut about it and that they're calming from that, right? Again, there's a sensory piece to it, so that behavioral modification alone will not stop what's going on. And then the fifth thing is that they actually respond well to flexibility of the sensory situation within a structure and a routine. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you have a child that is refusing to go to lunch to the cafeteria, right? And that it's truly sensory in nature. We don't want to change that, okay, you don't have to go to the cafeteria. We want to actually encourage that they're doing the same thing as other children, but what we're doing is that we change that sensory piece. So maybe they're going into the cafeteria wearing headphones, or they go to the side of the cafeteria that doesn't have a lot of noise, or they can pick a buddy that they can sit next to, right? These are all strategies that we can use that help their sensory system, but we're staying within the structure and the routine of that day. And again, like I said before, many times what ends up happening is that, you know, the behaviors that we see is both sensory and behavioral, right? So where one starts and the other one stops, you know, it's a little difficult to tell. But again, you want to be able to try to implement strategies from both behavioral and sensory and see what really works for your child, you know, and track it. I think we become very, very good at tracking what some triggers could be. I know that one of the children that I work with, I know that if it starts getting too hot in the room, I'm going to start seeing behaviors, meltdowns, right? And it's not pretty, but I know that I have to keep that in mind, right? And it could look at times that he doesn't want to be participating in what we're doing, but it's actually, if the temperature in the room is starting to get a little too hot, he starts to react. So I have to be very, you know, careful with that. And I know that that it's a sensory trigger for him, right? So I track that as well. So I did do a past live stream, a past video on the differences between a meltdown and a tantrum, because those are two very different things, right? So a meltdown will be sensory in nature, whereas a tantrum will be behavioral in nature, and both of them have to be addressed very differently. So I have strategies, a lot of strategies for that in my other videos, so I will not go through them right now, but I will post a link for those of you that are interested in looking into that. But I think what we have to remember again is that it takes a little bit of detective work, right? To be able to tell if something is sensory in nature or truly behavioral, or if we're looking at a combination of both. So it's just about being, a little patient with ourselves and patient with our children, and trying to track that information so that we can tell what's going on. There's a lot of talk about sensory processing disorder, and I don't want people to think that if your child is having certain sensory issues going on, that right away it means that it's a sensory processing disorder. I think as therapists, we start seeing a lot more children with sensory challenges, and I don't think that they're truly sensory processing disorders. I think it's just the nature of the exposure that children have to the types of play they have nowadays, right? Again, it's not as movement based and movement oriented as when we were younger, right? Even if they're in the playground, we used to have merry-go-rounds, we used to have, swings. Some places don't even have swings anymore. We had a lot of movement, so we had a lot of input from the environment, and we were outdoors a lot, so the tactile, the all those senses were really stimulated at all times. But I find kids nowadays have much less exposure than we did, so they look like they appear a little bit more sensory in nature, and that's because their nervous system is not exposed as much as we did. So we kind of have to do it, we have to just expose them to it, and then it comes around. But again, a child that truly has sensory processing disorder, that looks a little bit different, because you have to really work on the exposure. You have to work on all that system, the vestibular system, the proprioceptive system, tactile defensiveness. There's a lot of areas I find that they have difficulty with processing. I don't always see that it's just one specific area. For example, tactile only. I would not say that it's a child that has sensory processing disorder, right? We all have something. For me, I know that it's auditory. I can't concentrate very well if I'm in a room that there's a lot of noise. It's hard for me to filter out information. So it doesn't mean that I have sensory processing disorder. No, I'm just more sensory towards auditory, but we learn to manage it. So again, I challenge you to become detectives when it comes to your children's behavior, just so that you can help track, is it something sensory, is it something that is behavioral? And again, there are approaches to take so that we can help them process that information. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, and have a wonderful weekend.